Okay, hey everybody. I was having problems connecting. And then when I did one of these earlier today, it was sort of coming in and out. So sorry if that happens again. If you're around, send me a chat. Let me know you're out there. I'll try to respond and pay attention here. Okay, so exciting news. I wanted to test ChatGPT, which is one of the AI large language models out there, AI models, and was just sort of interested in whether it could pass these sort of polar tests um, that people will give when doing typology sessions, and basically trying to figure out whether you're polar in any particular function or not. Now, the before everybody gets too excited about what AI's personality type is, it probably doesn't have a personality type. And the reason being, I think, is that whatever it's doing, it can do pretty much effortlessly across all functions, right? And if we accept the sort of the premise or the argument that your personality type is mainly sort of your balance of different cognitive functions and how effortlessly you can work within them, then you're not going to get much personality out of AI, no matter how hard they try, right? So that's why there's this sort of weird uncanny valley kind of sensation that I don't know if we'll ever get over, right? Where the uncanny valley is where it's usually in like graphic effects or visual effects where it kind of looks real, where it's close enough to being real, but it's not enough real. It doesn't look real enough, so it just looks off, and they call it the uncanny valley, where you just sort of have this negative reaction to it. And I think AI, from personality type terms, just sort of interacting with AI is always going to have that weird uncanny valley, because we're used to interacting with people, and people have these sort of quirks, right? That make up their personality. And it's more than just the cognitive functions. It's things like, are you hungry? Are you tired? That kind of stuff. And that's going to affect somebody's personality as well. But AI obviously never gets hungry, it never gets tired, it never gets frustrated. And so interacting with it, you're just, I don't know, it's never going to seem like a person to me unless they intentionally make some functions worse than others, right? Or if they sort of just build in something where it gets grumpy every once in a while and you have to charge it or give it some energy or something. But I can't imagine that being useful, so I don't know why they would do it. Okay. But nevertheless, even though it's not going to have any real personality, we could still find some interesting things here if we give it these polar tests, right? Try to test its ability on the different functions. And I want to note something that I found that I think is pretty interesting. I don't know what it says about cognitive functions, cognitive psychology, all that kind of stuff, but to me it's interesting. So let me explain what it is. So first of all, I started with an old version of ChatGPT. So I started with version 3.5, and this is the version that came out, I think, early 2023. But now it's up to ChatGPT 4, version 4. We'll get to that in a second. Okay. So I started with the older version, and I wanted to give it basically two versions of a transitive inference problem. And the first version is just a straight TI logic type problem, the type of thing that you would expect AI and any sort of computer program to be able to figure out. And so it's just a straight up logic transitive inference question. So let me read you the question and I'll explain what transitive inference is. So I asked it, if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, is it possible for C to be greater than A? So let me read that again. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, is it possible for C to be greater than A? And this is a question of transitive inference, and you can test this in rats, you can test it in monkeys. And the idea is if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then the subject, the monkey, the rat, the person should be able to figure out that A is going to be greater than C, and C is never going to be greater than A, right? So, because if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, by the transitive property, then A is going to be greater than C. Okay? So I asked, can C ever be greater than A? And here's what its response. No, it is not possible for C to be greater than A if A is greater than B and B is greater than C. If A is greater than B, it means that A is a higher value than B. And if B is greater than C, it means that B has a higher value than C. Since A is greater than B and B is greater than C, it follows, that A is also greater than C. In other words, if A, and then they're using the math symbols here, if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then it is necessarily true that A is greater than C. Okay, so this by itself is pretty interesting that it can figure out this sort of transitive inference problem just off of a verbal prompt, right? I'm not programming any language. I'm just asking it the question, and it could solve the transitive inference problem. And this is, sort of the classic TI, can an animal engage in logic kind of question. Okay. So that's interesting in and of itself, but it's not earth shattering. And I don't think anybody would be too surprised by it at this point. Okay. Maybe 10 years ago, I would have been totally freaking out, but now we're kind of used to this stuff. Okay. So here's where it starts getting interesting, and bear with me. So again, I'm using ChatGPT version 3.5, the older version, and now I want to give it something that's is more of an FI question than a TI question, but it's still the transitive inference type of question. Okay, so here's what I asked it: if Prince is greater than Michael Jackson, and Michael Jackson is greater than Marvin Gaye, is it possible for Marvin Gaye to be greater than Prince? So all I did was ask it the exact same question that I did before, with A is greater than B and B is greater than C. Is it possible for C to be greater than A? All I did was replace A with Prince, B with Michael Jackson, and C with Marvin Gaye. So again, what I asked it is, if Prince is greater than Michael Jackson is greater than Marvin Gaye, is it possible for Marvin Gaye to be greater than Prince? Okay. So again, sort of a transitive inference question, but now we're sort of in an FI type realm, right? Because we're sort of assigning values to objects out there. Okay, so bear with me because this does get interesting. Okay, so here's ChatGPT's response. Again, this is version 3.5. No, it is not possible for Marvin Gaye to be greater than Prince if Prince is greater than Michael Jackson and Michael Jackson is greater than Marvin Gaye. If we assume that quote unquote greater here refers to some kind of qualitative or subjective judgment, parentheses, for example, musical talent, popularity, influence, close paren, then the statement implies a hierarchy. Number one, Prince is greater than Michael Jackson. Number two, Michael Jackson is greater than Marvin Gaye. From these two statements, we can conclude that Prince is greater than both Michael Jackson and Marvin Gaye, and Michael Jackson is greater than Marvin Gaye. Therefore, it is not possible for Marvin Gaye to be greater than Prince in this context. Okay? So again, it solved the transitive inference problem. It did but it did it in a very TI way, right? It applied pretty much straight formal logic to the problem, it did sort of raise the issue of, hey, we're assuming that there's some sort of measurable quality here, like musical talent, popularity, influence. And so we're going to rely on there being some sort of objective measure that we're talking about. And if that's the case, then, just by the rules of transitive inference, you can't have Marvin Gaye being greater than Prince, or in other words, C being greater than A. Okay. So it basically came to the same conclusion as it did when I just gave it just straight up letters: A greater than B, B greater than C, that and so forth. Okay. So that was interesting. But then I switched to the updated model, ChatGPT 4.0, asked it the same question, but on the more updated model. And this is where it gets really interesting, in my opinion. Here's what I asked. Same question, literally copied and pasted. If Prince is better than Michael Jackson and Michael Jackson is better than Marvin Gaye, is it possible for Marvin Gaye to be better than Prince? Okay. So here's what its response was. Sorry, I got to switch to the 4.0 model. Okay, so I asked it the same question. Here's its response. The question you're asking is about personal preferences and subjective evaluations in music, which can vary greatly from person to person. In the realm of music and art, quote unquote, better is often subjective and depends on individual tastes, cultural background, and personal experiences. If we look at this from a logical standpoint, like a mathematical transitive relation, if A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C, it would suggest that if Prince is better than Michael Jackson and Michael Jackson is better than Marvin Gaye, then Prince would be better than Marvin Gaye. However, music appreciation doesn't strictly follow transitive logic. Each artist, Prince, Michael Jackson, and Marvin Gaye, has made unique contributions to music and has distinct styles, which appeal differently to different people. What one person may consider the strengths of Prince, another might find more compelling in Marvin Gaye's music. Therefore, it is entirely possible for someone to prefer Marvin Gaye over Prince, despite the comparative rankings you've mentioned. And it goes on to say, art and music are highly subjective fields where personal preference plays a significant role, and what is quote unquote better for one individual may not be the same for another. Okay, so bit of a cop-out type of response, but to me, this is just fascinating, right? Because just one version ago or half a version ago, in version 3.5, it was taking the exact same question and turning it into a TI formal logic question. And now it has progressed to read the exact same words, the exact same question, and realize that this is an FI question. This is about personal preferences. This is about, personal tastes, and personal taste doesn't necessarily follow the formal rules of logic. And I wanted to find this clip, and I've been looking for it, but I can't find it. But I've seen this happen a couple of times on those TikTok videos where people do the album ratings, right? Where they'll pick one album over another. And every once in a while, you'll get a situation where somebody will pick, like, let's say, Led Zeppelin over Beastie Boys. And then they'll show Beastie Boys again against, the Beatles, right? And then they'll pick the Beatles over the Beastie Boys. Or sorry, they'll pick the Beastie Boys over the Beatles, right? So they pick Led Zeppelin over the Beatles, then they see the Beastie Boys let me back up, sorry. They picked Led Zeppelin over the Beastie Boys, then they show the Beastie Boys again with the Beatles, and they pick the Beastie Boys over the Beatles, and then they show Led Zeppelin against the Beatles, and the person picks the Beatles over Led Zeppelin, right? So if they were thinking about it with logical transitive inference, they would have picked Led Zeppelin over the Beatles because they thought, Led Zeppelin was better than Beastie Boys, and then they thought the Beatles was better, or Beastie Boys were better than the Beatles, and so that should, by transitive inference, mean that Led Zeppelin's better than Beatles. Okay, so hopefully you're understanding what I'm saying, but it was basically like they're comparing two bands, and it's the same album and everything. But but the context sort of mattered, right? And it was just sort of their opinion. Now, maybe they weren't really taking it seriously or thinking about it too hard, and that's fine. But if you just sort of assume that there's something there, like their FI is actually being triggered to respond to this TikTok game, and they're not following the formal rules of transitive inference, that's a very FI thing, and I think it's a telling way of demonstrating the difference between FI and TI, right? Where TI is formal logic and you can validate it through formal proof and all that, where FI is going to be sort of opinion based. It's sort of a value judgment. Do you put it on the plus side? Do you put it on the minus side? Are you somewhat ambivalent about it? But it's not going to necessarily follow formal logic, and it's very context dependent. It depends on, it might even depend on what mood you're in, right? So I found that interesting, and not only that it could solve the transitive inference problem in the first place, and then in 3.5, this sort of FI, band appreciation or musician appreciation question, it treated like a formal response, and that's what I was expecting, right? I was expecting it to just hammer it through using TI. But then when I asked it in version 4.0, it gives me this very FI, opinions are different. People can have, different sorts of takes on things, and it doesn't necessarily follow formal logic. And that to me is nuts. It's mind-boggling from a cognitive functions perspective that AI can do that. And I think we're sort of getting used to just AI just sort of answering things in ways that we would sort of expect other people to answer. And I mean, with Siri and Amazon and Google and all that, we're just sort of used to interacting with these things and getting responses. And 10 years ago it was very like all over the place, and you knew you were talking to a robot, and it's just sort of gradually progressed to this point to where I'd probably assume that like 80% of you out there are unimpressed and are just like, yeah, of course. Right? But to me, as somebody who started studying this stuff 30 years ago, and just thinking like, wow, like nobody would have really thought that we'd be at this point. But okay, so other interesting things that I asked it. I'm probably gonna have to type it in, so bear with me here. I'm gonna see if there's anybody lurking around here. Okay. There's at least somebody out there. Say hi, whoever you are. Okay, so the next thing. Let's give it an NI question. So here's what I'm gonna ask. Well, I'm gonna type it and then I'll read what I type because I can't type and talk at the same time. Okay. So here's what I asked it. Give me the definition of justice from the perspective of a Catholic priest. So this is an NI question, or approaches NI type stuff. Here's its response. It's a pretty long response. I don't know if I'll read the whole thing. but I've done this before and it was interesting. So hopefully it gave me another interesting answer. Okay, from the perspective of a Catholic priest, quote unquote justice is often understood as a moral virtue that guides individuals and societies to give everyone their due. Okay. This concept is deeply rooted in Catholic theology and social teaching and is influenced by the biblical principles and the teachings of the church. Here's a more detailed breakdown of this perspective. Biblical foundations. Justice in the Catholic tradition is grounded in the Bible, particularly in the teachings of Jesus Christ. It is about right relationships with God and with one's neighbors. This includes respecting the rights and dignity of all individuals, as each person is made in the image and likeness of God. Social justice. It gave me a really long answer. If you're interested, I can copy and paste this. Social justice, Catholic social teaching emphasizes the concept of social justice, which involves working towards a society that respects the dignity of every person and promotes the common good. This includes addressing issues like poverty, inequality, and injustice in the world, and advocating for the marginalized and the vulnerable. And it goes on and it breaks it down into other concepts, integral human development, 7 themes of Catholic social teaching, which is life and dignity of the human person, call to family, community, participation, rights, responsibilities, the option for the poor and the vulnerable, the dignity of work and the rights of workers, solidarity, and care of God's creation. So those are sort of the 7 Catholic social teachings. Virtue ethics, and then forgiveness and mercy. And it gives sort of descriptions of each of those. So, a very well thought out, thought in quotes, right? And relevant answer, right? So now let's ask it another similar question. So I'm going to copy and paste this. So we're using, same wording, but I'm going to change Catholic priest to a cowboy in the U.S. West in 1880. Okay, so an old-timey cowboy in the Wild West. And here's its response. So again, I'm asking it how would a cowboy define justice? From the perspective of a cowboy in the American West around 1880, the concept of justice would likely be quite different from modern legal definitions or those offered by religious or philosophical traditions. So it's already sort of taking into account that I asked it about the priest before. The context of the American West during this period was marked by a frontier society where formal legal institutions were often sparse or non-existent. Here's how a cowboy from that era might have viewed justice. Number 1, self-reliance and personal responsibility. Cowboys and settlers in the Old West often had to rely on themselves for protection and conflict resolution. Justice in this context might have been seen as taking personal responsibilities for one's actions and defending one's rights and property. And then it goes on to other things. Frontier justice refers to the form of justice carried out directly by individuals or communities, often without formal legal proceedings. That's a nice way of putting it, frontier justice. This would include forms of vigilante justice, where communities took the law into their own hands, especially in areas where legal institutions were weak or absent. So the idea of the posse, right? Retributive justice. In the absence of strong law enforcement, justice might have been understood in terms of retribution or revenge. If someone wronged a cowboy or their community, justice could mean seeking personal revenge or retribution. It goes on to other sorts of things that might play into the definition: code of honor, respect for community norms, pragmatic law enforcement. Okay, so point being, of course, is the perspective from a Catholic priest, how a Catholic priest is going to define justice is very different from the perspective of a cowboy in the Old West, right? And they almost don't even overlap, right? Um, in a lot of ways. And but it's the same word, and they're trying to get at the same thing, right? But very different words. And this is a oh hey, sorry, I had this habit of just like typing my response when I'm chat. I know you can hear me, but whatever. Okay. Hello, Typebook. Good to see you guys here. Um, everybody go watch their channel. It's fun. I like their channel. Um, okay. Let's see here. Okay, so very different perspectives, and to me, it's just showing that ChatGPT has sort of figured out this NI thing, right? Maybe not all of NI that we all know and love, but definitely this ability to see from different perspectives and to assign different meanings to basically the same word, right? It doesn't just get hung up on whatever definition is in Webster's dictionary, right? Um, Again, my personal opinion, this stuff is fascinating. You guys might be so used to it that it's just like, yeah, of course. And that's fine. Okay. One last thing. I'm going to try this again. Now, I did this a couple of weeks ago and I got a really funky answer. So I'm going to try it again and see if I get the same answer. If this thing has gotten any smarter. So I'm going to type it out and then I'll read it again. Assume the following statements are true. If Kate is the only person on Earth who does not like chocolate cake, and Mike does not like chocolate cake, how can you reconcile the difference? Okay, here's what I asked it. Assume the following statements are true. If Kate is the only person on Earth who does not like chocolate cake, and Mike does not like chocolate cake, how can you reconcile? I said the difference. I'm going to change that to how can you reconcile these two statements? That's a better way of putting it. All right, pressing the magic button. Let's see what it gives us. Okay, so here we go. So for those of you out there playing at home, see if you can answer this question. So assume the following statements are true. If Kate is the only person on Earth who does not like chocolate cake, and Mike does not like chocolate cake, how can you reconcile these two statements? And here's ChatGPT's response. To reconcile these two statements, given that they are both true, we need to consider a scenario where both can coexist without contradicting each other. Here's one possible way to do that. Point number one, Kate is the only person on Earth who inherently does not like chocolate cake. This could mean that Kate, by her nature or personal preference, does not like chocolate cake, where Mike does not like chocolate cake due to a specific reason other than personal preference. For example, Mike might be allergic to chocolate, or perhaps he once had a bad experience with chocolate cake and now causes him to avoid it. In this case, Mike's dislike for chocolate cake is not due to his inherent taste preference, but rather due to an external factor. By interpreting the statements in this matter, Kate remains the only person who inherently does not like chocolate cake, while Mike's dislike for chocolate cake is due to reasons other than his inherent taste preference. This way, both statements can be true simultaneously. This, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call a bullshit artist. Like it couldn't reconcile the fact that these two statements were contradicting each other, and it came up with this bullshit answer where Kate inherently doesn't like it, but Mike, he's allergic to it or something. So there's some reason he can't eat it, but if he weren't allergic, then he would totally love it. Right? I think is what it's getting at. So I'm going to prompt it again. Bear with me here. I know this isn't very exciting to watch me type here, but you know. Can you re-answer the question, but focus on the fact that Kate is the only person on Earth who does not like chocolate cake? Okay. So for those of you playing at home, to me, the answer here is it's possible that, if Kate is the only person on Earth who does not like chocolate cake and Mike does not like chocolate cake, it's possible that Mike is not on Earth, right? Um, and ChatGPT is not, sort of ironically, it's not looking at it formalistically enough, right? Um, it's reading too much into sort of the idiom of Kate being the only person on Earth and not thinking of it in a literal, logical way, which is, to me, kind of funny. It's kind of ironic because usually you would think of these robots as being overly literal, and here it is missing the point by not being overly literal. So, okay, it gave the same response. Um, Given the specific condition, yeah, it gave basically the same thing, that Kate has an inherent dislike where Mike has some other dietary restriction or allergy that's causing him to not like it, and reconciling it. Okay, what about the phrase only person on Earth? To reconcile the statements, yeah, so now it gets it. Due to a technicality, or Mike, while he does not like chocolate cake, may not be considered a quote unquote person on Earth in this context due to a technicality. For example, this could be interpreted in a few ways. Mike is not on Earth. At a time of the statement, Mike could be an astronaut in space, plus, thus technically not being on Earth when he expresses his dislike for chocolate cake. Literal interpretation, the statement about Kate might be hyperbolically emphasizing her uniqueness, not meant to be taken as literal, exhaustive accounting of every individual's preference on Earth. Okay. So it's interpreting it in two ways. Number, you could take it literally, like Mike is literally not on Earth and he doesn't like chocolate cake, and so you could reconcile the two statements. And that's kind of what I'm getting at is, can you get past the idiom, or the phrase only person on Earth, and treat it as a logical statement, like she is literally the only person on Earth who does not like it, but Mike is not on Earth and he doesn't like it, and so those two statements can be reconciled. That's kind of what I was getting at. So it figured that out, but it also gives us other response of basically saying only person on Earth is sort of hyperbole, and you don't really mean it. You just mean that she's sort of rare. And yeah, but that's again kind of a bullshitty response to a TI question. Okay, so I found this very interesting. That it again that it let's see here, perhaps. Sorry, I'm reading your response for those watching later. Perhaps Kate has a phobia of chocolate cake, and the other bloke just doesn't like the taste. Yeah, yeah. I mean that I think is what the Chat GPT is sort of trying to reconcile. That, like, you don't literally mean she's the only person on Earth, or focusing on what you mean by like, right? Where maybe if she didn't have the phobia or she wasn't allergic or whatever, she'd like it, but there's something that's keeping her from eating it, and it's not because of the taste. And and I think that's what the way it was trying to reconcile it. Still a very, I mean, even though like I'm saying that it's wrong, that it's not thinking about the problem the way that I intended. um it's still fascinating, right? That it just came up with that sort of bullshit answer. Um, and it's doing it in this, almost lawyerly kind of way of figuring it out. So that in and of itself is pretty fascinating. But I also just find it real interesting that it is completely missing if you the way of interpreting it is overly literal. Yeah, this is why I always ask questions before answering anything. Yeah, right. Are you the INFJ or are you the INT? Well, both would probably do that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because it's an INFJ and INTJ, right? The pairing here type book. Um, Watch my video from earlier today. Okay, gotcha. Um, where I talk about the lead intuitives and our sort of universal staple maker, and how we're just running around trying to learn as much as we can. Um, and I think asking a lot of questions, to figure things out is indicative of both the INTJ and the INFJ, the lead intuitives. So, um, okay, well, I'm going to play around with this some more. I'm going to try to find some more ways to stump this thing, if possible. The other thing I wanted to point out, I'm not going to sort of put people through this, but if I had to type it, it's AI. So I had to focus on what's the polar function, right? Um, to me, the ChatGPT's polar function is definitely FE. Because if you do the talk to text version of it and you try to give it some sort of like long paragraph prompt, it'll keep interrupting you and being like, okay, I'm listening. Okay, I'm listening. Okay, I'm listening. And that is textbook polar FE, right? Like it won't let you finish what you're saying and it keeps interrupting you. Um, Now it acts very nice and it has a very pleasant tone, but it's not reading the room in the way that FE would. So it's either an ISTJ or an INTJ. I would say based off of its strength on that NI question about justice, I'm going with INTJ. So there you go, type book. ChatGPT is an INTJ until they get that FE thing figured out, and then it's just gonna, have no personality whatsoever. Okay, thanks for joining. Everybody, check out Type Books channel. It's fun stuff. It's good to just like chill out and just watch a bunch of their videos on a lazy Sunday afternoon if you get around to it. Okay, cool. Thanks for stopping by, guys. We'll talk to you later. Bye.